Hey guys, on this week's episode, I have a special guest. His name's David Couch. He's a friend of mine from back at our days at Southwestern. We actually met because we were next door neighbors down there. But these days, he is the executive director of Bifork Baptist Association in Vernon, Texas. And so he's going to have some great things to say, understanding church conflict and just the struggles that pastors face. Welcome back to the Speak Life podcast. Thanks for being here. Welcome back to the Speak Life podcast. This week, I get to talk with David Couch. David is the executive director of Bifork Baptist Association in Vernon, Texas. David, welcome to the Speak Life podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it, Bill.
Yeah, absolutely. And so why don't you just take a few minutes as we're getting started, talk a little bit about yourself, your background, and kind of your background in ministry as well.
Yeah, so I'm married 26 years. My beautiful wife, Carrie, she is a speech language pathologist, and she grew up here in Vernon as well as me. So we were, I guess you could say, high school sweethearts. We have our oldest daughter is 25, and so we started with kids right out of the gate. Matter of fact, when we graduated college, she was about 3 months old. So we
Oh, wow. Okay.
Man, we got after it. And then we have a youngest daughter who is she is 16, so they're 9 years apart, and she is currently a sophomore in high school. And she actually is. We're living in my wife's home that she grew up in. We're taking care of family.
Oh, wow. Okay.
This small town here in Vernon.
Yeah, when we caught up the other day. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So anyway, ministry-wise, I've been serving in churches since I was about 19 years old. Matter of fact, I can remember being a youth minister, and a couple of years ago, Carrie and I were talking about that, and I realized that this church allowed us to take kids to camp and drive them places when I was 19, and the oldest kids were seniors in high school when they were 17 and 18. And it was kind of amazing. So starting out in ministry, I started out young doing youth ministry almost as a teenager.
All right. And then you, ended up transitioning into counseling, and now also are getting to serve as executive director for Bifork Baptist Association. So I think it's interesting. We joked about this a second ago before I started this part of the recording. But it's fun giving this introduction saying executive director of the Baptist Association down there as compared to a different introduction that I could give. This is David Couch, who was my next door neighbor at Southwestern Seminary when we were students together way back when. Actually, pretty funny story how we actually first met. You were helping me move in, and I'm going to let you tell from your perspective what that was like.
I'd love to. That was hilarious. Yeah, moving in. I remember you moving in, and you asked me. I think I may have seen you moving, and I just offered to help. And we were, if I remember correctly, we were moving some big piece of furniture upstairs, and I think I was complaining about one of my graders in my counseling classes, and it was at that point you decided to stop me real quick and let me know you were that grader.
That was me. Yeah, that was me, the grader. Really strict on this is something. I mean, this is for pastors, and so I think all pastors, especially who've been to a Southern Baptist seminary, can reminisce and have some understanding for you. That one of the things I was hard on was dear Kate Turabian and Turabian Formatting and Papers, so they're going to like me less now if they know that I was pretty hard on Turabian, but that's all right. So that was a fun way to meet. I remember it was the Hope Chest that we were carrying in, and I remember saying, that grader was me. Please don't drop the Hope Chest, as we're standing in the middle of the staircase going up the steps in there.
That's so funny.
So it's funny how things transition since then. So we've both moved different parts of you have moved kind of several different parts of the state of Texas, and I ended up leaving Texas and moving to several different parts of the country.
Yes.
And then we get to reconnect and talk a little bit about some things to help some pastors, and I'm excited about that. And you were telling me the other day that you've actually done some work, some additional training on helping churches through conflict resolution. Am I remembering that right?
Yes. Be One Another is a ministry, a nonprofit type deal, and through his name is Blake Coffey, and he takes us through a training where we meet with churches that have some kind of conflict, and they ask us to come in and do assessments, and we figure out through interviews and through just being a part of that church what the conflict may be, and then help them make a plan to assess the conflict and to get through it. And
Yeah.
sometimes that can be pretty tough, and sometimes pretty simple, just misunderstandings.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly churches, we have no shortage of conflict, in part
Right.
because churches are made up of fallen humans all over the place. So,
Yeah.
pretty easy to have conflict.
Yeah.
With that being said, what we kind of typically talk about on the podcast is what are some of the challenges you've seen or experienced in ministry? And so, why don't we just kind of jump into that?
Some challenges and things that I've seen, been a part of, and we're seeing in ministry. Uh, Number one, I've witnessed a lot of smaller churches. I'm learning. I came from some pretty large churches in the Metroplex, and
Mm.
it's kind of funny when I went from a large church to a smaller church. Not it was many years ago, probably 20 years ago. I noticed I didn't have an assistant, a secretary, so I had to learn how to print things and to order things and to do things that I didn't
Yeah.
have to do. And it dawned on me that there's a lot of pastors out there that they're multitasking, doing a lot of things that I just took for granted. Um, and that being said, I've noticed too that these pastors in these smaller churches are pretty lonely. They're pretty isolated, and the expectations are just across the board of different members, different church members, from the the chairman of the deacons down to the widow lady that wants them to come visit once a week. So there's a lot of expectations, a lot of demands in a small church. Something I've also seen, I've witnessed transitions from a senior pastor in a very large church to a new pastor. So we're talking a pastor of 20, 28, 30 years leading a church,
Mm.
a large congregation, and then having a new pastor come in who does things completely different, and all the effect that has on not just staff but church members and uh, even the community at large.
So why don't we talk about that last one for a minute? I'm going to point out, just again, I've recorded. I'm in the double digits now for the number of episodes we've done,
Yeah,
but we're almost in the double digits the number of times I have asked what are common challenges that are faced, and somebody brings up loneliness. It,
yeah,
it's a topic that keeps coming up, uh, that we clearly need to find some pathways to work on for pastors. I'm going to be interested in hearing your suggestions on that. But I kind of want to jump in on that last thing you said first, because that's a topic we haven't really covered yet in much
mm,
depth. What happens when you've got a long time senior pastor and they leave the ministry, and leave the ministry for understandable reasons? They're
right,
seasoned, they're at the end of their
right,
career and they're retiring. You do occasionally have a pastor who leaves the ministry because they've passed away. And then we have other times that it's just somebody's moving on to a new church, right? And they've been there for, like you said, 20 years. And there are some changes that come along with that. Uh,
right.
Talk about some of that. I know that I've seen that a couple times. What have you seen?
Yeah, I think there's obviously a generational thing as well. So the expectations of a pastor that kind of started out in the '60s, '70s, those expectations are different from a pastor that is fairly new, that starts out in the '80s, '90s, and
Okay.
you do find that. Uh, I think technology has a lot to do with that. Circumstances
Yeah.
has a lot to do with that. And then, as after a long tenured pastor, usually that pastor that follows him uh, doesn't last very long because all the changes that take place, and I think they're mourning the loss of that system, and creating a new system causes even more anxiety. And
Yeah.
I think there are some pastors that come into this situation, and I think their purpose literally is to be an agitator and to help the church
Mm.
kind of break up. If you think about breaking up loose things so that you can be better, it forces that church to kind of
Yeah.
reevaluate who they are and what they are. And if a pastor can stick around and help move them in that direction, that's good.
Yeah. It's not only who they are and what they are, right? It's also a little bit of what they've been doing and why they've been doing it.
Right, right,
Like I can
right,
think easily of situations where, church has done the same thing the same way for 20 years because it's
right.
just how we've always done things around here. Kind of the 11th commandment, so to speak. We've never done it
Right,
that way before.
right,
It's
right,
that kind of idea.
right.
And that's a time to reevaluate, especially if that new person coming in is more of an agitator.
Yeah.
Uh, so what have you seen? What have you heard about? Well, I'm thinking through interims. The idea of,
Mm-hmm.
as you have somebody leave like that, until you have an interim period until you hire somebody new. There are some people who take that on as a ministry unto itself, doing an
Right,
intentional interim where they know
right.
I'm coming in, I'm going to help you to reevaluate some things, to think about who you are as a church.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, what are things you've seen with that? What's a recommended time frame for that? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I know several of these pastors that are intentional interims, and of course they're trained through the state conventions, and uh, they're assigned to a church that may request it or request an intentional interim, and sometimes that takes 6 months to a year. Sometimes it takes 2 to 3 years. And what's fascinating is they go through things like the Constitution and their bylaws. They go through some of the more formal things, and then and I know that just working with churches in our area, uh, the questions I often ask them are who are you as a church, and what do you expect of your pastor, and make sure that those things are clearly understood, because there's a lot of those things that are just they're subtle. They're not written down. They're just ambiguous, and they have these unrealistic expectations. And so
Hmm.
to sit down and really clarify what are our expectations of our pastor helps them to kind of narrow down who they want to be their pastor in the future.
Yeah. So, yeah, so we're talking about a pretty serious intentional time of evaluation, right? And
Right.
and I'm going to throw into that a conversation I know I've had a couple of times, that when there's that kind of evaluation, it's also good to evaluate not only what are you expecting of the pastor, but just so they come in eyes wide open, what are you expecting of the pastor's wife? Like you said,
Yes.
there can be some big differences in those situations. You've got somebody who got started in the 60s and 70s, and they may well have gone on a model where she was able to stay at home and
Right.
raise kids and all that. And more recently, the model is frequently two parent family where they're both working, a two
Yeah.
worker
Two
model.
income family. Right.
Yeah, two income family. There's the phrase that I couldn't find. Thank you for
I
that.
gotcha.
And
I'm
so,
very
yeah,
familiar with that.
so yeah, two income family, and it's a different scenario. She is not, the pastor's wife is not as available
Yeah.
for playing the piano every week and teaching every Sunday school class that needs a fill in and all, whatever
Right.
it is, right? And so having some clarity on that can be beneficial.
Right. Definitely. And I think those pastors that have that, they need to make that expectation clear of what they're calling us and what their spouse is calling us. My wife's professional, and she's actually more of a professional than I am. I'll put it that way. At least she's a lot
All
smarter
right.
than me. But yeah, we set the expectation. My wife is this is not a 2-for-1 deal, and her expectations are that of any church member.
Yeah. Yeah. So gosh, there's a few things that are going through my mind as we're talking about this, because it occurs to me that, we're talking with plenty of people out there who are pastors who, number one, are maybe thinking about retiring at some point, and
Mm-hmm.
uh, need to be able to think through how to prep their church for what to consider next. And we might also be
Mm-hmm.
talking to some people who've been burned in some ways on this. And here's what I mean by that. Part of what you mentioned a couple minutes ago was, you'll have a pastor who's been in that position, who comes in after the longtime
Mm-hmm.
pastor, the 20-year pastor, and they end up being a short termer. And the way I
Mm-hmm.
refer to that is they end up being an accidental interim, is what
Right.
happens,
Right.
because there really is some intentional work that needs to be done in an interim period to help a church to reconsider, who they were because of the old pastor and the directions he's
Right.
led, who they are based on, who's in their church, the
Right.
community they're in, and how that community maybe has changed over 20 years, and what they have done or haven't done to meet the needs of that community, what they want to do to meet the needs of that community, and who it is that they feel like God's calling them to be as they move forward and prepare for a new pastor coming in. And I think if a church doesn't do that and they rush to hire someone,
Mm-hmm.
uh, they end up hiring somebody who becomes that accidental interim. Tell me
Right.
if you've heard this before. The number I typically hear is that an interim period should last somewhere in the neighborhood, and this doesn't have to be exact, but roughly somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1 month of interim for every year of service of the pastor who just retired.
That sounds about right. Yeah, that would make sense. And then obviously that has a lot to do with the size of the church as well.
Okay, so speak into that a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah, I think the smaller the church, you get to navigate through the body a little bit quicker and understand who they are and
Okay,
where they are. And the larger the church, not so quick. There's probably some underlying things that have not been voiced or verbalized that could be problems in the future.
okay. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it from that perspective, but that makes a lot of sense. The perspective I thought about it from was, like, as soon as you said the size of the church matters, I was thinking, well, yeah, if we were got a much smaller church, they have less coverage
Uh-huh.
to take care of the needs that the pastor used to cover. Where in a larger church, you're likely to have more people to keep the ball rolling, so to speak, because you're also
Right,
probably dealing with a multi-staff church where some of those folks are still around. When the senior
right.
pastor leaves, the rest of the staff doesn't always leave right there at the exact same time. Hopefully, that would not be good. And so,
It does happen.
being able to cover some of that.
Right, right.
So as we're talking about that, I'm realizing, as I'm I'm seeing what's in the background behind me, I've got two books
Uh-huh.
right here that both have to do with pastor search. So if we've got anybody out there who is looking at that and thinking about that, here are two resources. The first one is Search, the Pastoral Search Committee Handbook by William. I can't read his name backwards on my
Vanderbloemen. Yeah, that's Vanderbloemen.
Vanderbloemen. And then the other one
It's a
that
good
I've
book.
got here is The Church During the Search,
Yes,
Honoring Christ While You Wait for Your Next Pastor,
yes.
Jason Lowe. And so those aren't the only ones. There are some good resources out there. The Vanderbloemen book sounds like one that you've heard before as well.
Yes, yeah. That's a good company, good ministry.
Okay, so if you're listening to this or watching this, and you're recognizing there's going to be a search coming, there's some really good resources out there for this. But probably what I would lean into the most is be intentional about what you're going to do in the interim period. And it sounds like
Right.
I see you nodding your head in that same thought.
Yes. Yeah, very much so. I think it's good to have. I would even recommend having someone from your state convention come in, or someone from your association come in, and just at least evaluate and give a recommendation of what needs to go on, what needs to happen next. And I've had some of the smallest churches just come in and ask me to show up on a Sunday morning, maybe preach a sermon, maybe interview some of the search committee, talk about what's going on, take an assessment or a pulse of the church, if you will, and then make a recommendation of what to do next. Sometimes I would say, hey, you need to go ahead and get your committee started and get going. And then sometimes I say, I would recommend you bring in an intentional interim through your convention. and work through some issues
Yeah.
that maybe need to be addressed before that next pastor comes in.
Yeah. We actually just went through this at my church pretty recently. We had a pastor he'd been on staff for, I think, 22 years, and he'd been the actual pastor for about
Wow.
18. He'd been the associate for that before that. And he retired. He actually transitioned into a different role right after, I say after, sometime during COVID. It's all a little bit of a blur
Yeah,
right then. But
that's always
uh,
caused a blur.
but as
That
he,
could,
yeah. So I mean, that's a nice long pastor, and it was a good pastor, and it was an amicable parting, and I think that also plays a role, right? I
yeah,
mean, we have plenty of
yeah,
times when we can think of a church who's had a pastor for a long time, and he leaves, and there's a sayonara. Thanks for leaving, and
right,
that then there's also the churches where it's been a really good experience, and it's a sad parting, but it's healthy, right? And so
everybody knows it's the
that's
right
kind of
time.
what, yeah, that's kind of where we were. It was a sad time. It had been a really good pastor, but it was also understanding of it's the right time. It's the time to make a transition, and we ended up having a pretty long interim. It was uh, about a year, I think, is what we did, um, but with some intentional, some strong intentionality in how we dealt with it. And part of that was we had some preachers come in and in an interim way. But we also then had somebody come in and serve in an administrative role, and that person was more the uh, not really the interim pastor, so to speak, the interim administrator to make sure the ministries of the church kept going.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, multi-staff church, and it ended up being a good experience. We were able to expose some things that needed to be exposed, and there were some things that changed. There were some more people who left at that point too, which is not uncommon to have people when you
Right,
start looking at who we are, who we've become, who are we being called to be. Not everybody on staff's on board for that, and so that can result in some changes as well. And so we're really excited with the new pastor we have. It's actually a guy who was at Southwestern with us. David is. I don't know if you remember Adam Hughes or not, but he's our
yeah,
pastor at First Baptist now, and it's been a great experience. We're really excited to have him. Um, but I wonder if we had not been intentional about how that interim period had worked beforehand, how different things might be right
right,
now.
right.
Uh,
Because they kind of
because that,
inherit some problems.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Uh, it,
and
and
if you can
people,
deal with those on the front end during the intentional time, then that makes a smoother runway, if you will, for that pastor to land.
yeah, it really does. And then the other thing that can happen if if it's not an intentional interim period, the longer it is, the longer there's a power vacuum, and then there's
Mm-hmm.
opportunity for other unhealthy things to start to come up.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, as I'm saying all of this, it occurs to me that this is a place where there's a pretty natural transition to talking about church conflict,
Right.
because this is where some conflicts arise. They'll arise in the midst of that power vacuum. They'll arise, right on the heels of a new pastor coming. I immediately start thinking about group dynamics stuff, right?
Right.
Just how groups tend to work. There's some phases they tend to go through.
Right.
The phases for any of you who are listening and you don't know what those phases are, there's five of them, and they don't all start with the same letter like a good Baptist would have them start, but they end
Right.
with a similar sound.
I'm with you.
Forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning, right? And so
Right.
uh, forming is kind of that honeymoon period that happens right as a new pastor is getting in place and things are going well and everybody's excited. The new pastor is excited, his family's excited, and the church as a whole is excited because we have a new pastor and we're
Yeah.
moving forward. And then the storming phase shows up, and that's when the honeymoon is over and people start
Yes.
voicing their concerns, and that's where some arguments start to show up and can lead to some productive conflict, but also can lead to some nasty conflict. And so
Right.
talk a little bit about what you've seen and experienced and what that works well in conflict resolution for churches.
Right. I think it's very important because our emotions start to get to play in these conflicts, and we begin to be reactive and not proactive. And it's
Mm.
kind of fascinating because you see people, and I've heard this many times, is there are people in our church I've never seen them act the way that they're acting. It's not themselves. And then
Yeah.
you can even interview those individuals and say, who are you? And they'll say, I don't know. I'm not. This is not who I am. And we have to go back to understand that if we're not displaying the fruits of the Spirit in the midst of a
Mm.
conflict, then we probably don't need to be in the conflict at that moment. And we need to really review and take a look at that plank in our eye before we start working on the speck in someone else's. And so
Yeah.
being able to display those fruits of the Spirit and the characteristics that God's called us to have in the midst of conflict, and to not be reactive but be proactive, I think is crucial. And as I work with some of these individuals, so for example, uh, you know, when we ask the pastor questions, we're not asking the pastor in a critical way. We're asking the pastor in order to understand where we are, not trying to tell the pastor what to do different or tell the pastor what we want them to do, but help us understand. And so reframing the way that you approach the conflict sometimes seems to help.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I really like the idea of if you recognize you're not displaying the fruit of the Spirit in the middle of the conflict, that's a good time to not be in the conflict too. That takes a measure of wisdom, right? It takes a measure of
Yeah,
maturity to be willing
it's
to
an
say,
accountability.
that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. Have there been times when you've seen churches do that really well?
Yeah, the last church that I was in, I was there for about 15 years, a little over 15 years, and the pastor that came in to take over, he did something I thought was very fascinating. He would say, "We are going to do things that are not going to make you happy. We as a staff are going
Hmm.
to do things differently, and when you have a problem with that, my door is always open." And I want you to schedule an appointment, and I want you to come talk to me directly. And if you hear
Yeah.
something from somebody else, you need to ask them this question: what did the pastor say when you talked to him about that? And that was always fascinating
Yeah.
to me, because instead of allowing the gossip to happen, he would say, "Come straight to me." And if you hear it from someone else, you need to encourage them to go talk to me directly.
Yeah. Basically pointing right back at Matthew 18. If you've
Matthew
got an
18.
issue, take it to the person.
Go right to him. That's exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, if only people would do that on a regular basis,
It sounds so
right?
simple, but yet it's so
Yeah.
difficult because we allow those emotions to take over, and we want to do what the flesh calls us to do, and we're in a battle.
Yeah. And it's really easy to hear that and think of how church members do that, and they can be so frustrating when there's something they're feeling and they're just operating based off those feelings.
Hmm.
And we can forget that as church staff members, we do the same thing
We do,
plenty of times.
and we
Uh,
tend to forget that God is in charge of this. He has a
yeah,
plan. He has a purpose, and we need to respect the system that He's established for us. And if we do that, He's going to take charge, and He's going to put people in places that He wants.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Hey, as we're kind of getting to that time. Are there any final suggestions? Any resources specifically? I named a couple there earlier. Are there any
Yeah.
specific ones that you want to mention?
Yeah, in my working with leadership and pastors, I always recommend kind of a balance of things. But one of my favorite books recently is Paul David Tripp, the Lead book. I don't know if you're
Hmm.
familiar with that, but
I'm
uh,
not with that one.
he addresses a lot of very interesting things in that book. It's called Lead, and I believe it's chapter 12, one of chapter 12. It's how do you as a church deal with sin in the life of a pastor or a staff member.
Hmm.
A lot of times we want to just kind of avoid it and shun them and push them away, but modeling how that looks with other church members, because how you handle a pastor's sin tells the rest of the church how we're going to handle their sin. And
Yeah.
pretty interesting book. Another one I find interesting is Replenish by Witt. I want to say it's maybe Lance Witt.
Okay.
WITT. But it's called Replenish. It's a great book. I recommend it. And then Designed to Lead by Gregory or Geiger and Peck.
Okay.
And those are some good books I recommend.
All right. Good to know. Yeah. David, thank you so much for being on the show this week. I really appreciate you. I'm glad we were able to reconnect and do this. Lord bless you as you continue in your work. And that's it. For those of you listening, thanks for being here. And we'll have a new episode for you next week.